A couple of weeks ago, I spoke at Parshat Vayera about thinking differently about God. I spoke about answering the question that comes up so often: why does God let bad things happen to good people? And the solution I offered was abandoning a notion of a God who chooses that specifically, who decides who will stub their toe, who will develop cancer, who will win the lottery, who will win or lose a hockey match. Game? I don't know, I'm not Canadian. But I received afterwards a few thoughtful responses, questions that naturally follow such a sermon. If we rethink God and don't think of God as somebody who controls and picks and chooses things that happen down here on earth, why should we pray then? Or more precisely, if God doesn't decide what happens to me, why should I ask God for things? Why should I thank God for things? And it's a great question. It's not only an important question, but it's a necessary question if we're going to think about God differently. When we change our understanding of God, we have to also change our understanding of prayer. And I want to remind you that this need to think in depth about why we pray is not new. Prayer has always had its proponents and dissenting opinion, we'll say. Almost 2 millennia ago in the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel says every day a person should say the Amidah. Kol yom adam mitpalel shmona esrei. Each and every day you have to say the Amidah. But immediately following that, Rabbi Eliezer says, Haoseh tefilato keva ein tachanunim. If a person makes their prayers fixed, they cease to be prayer. It makes sense. Each week we read the same words from the pages of the Siddur, words that were written a long time ago. How can you say each day, 3 times a day with meaning, words that somebody else wrote? How can words express how you feel in this very moment when they come from somebody else's moment, a moment that has long been lost to history? And that's the starting point of prayer. Add to that a belief in a God who doesn't act like a teenager playing The Sims on a computer, reaching down and handing things out, moving people around at will, then you get a complicated question. Why should we pray? And I can't tell you what the answer to this question should be for you. I only this morning want to share my own answer, the answer that works for me. And the point of this sermon isn't to tell you that if prayer works for you, you should change your way of thinking about it. But for the many people, whether they admit it or not, that prayer doesn't really work for them, I want to offer you a different way of thinking about it and encourage you to think about it for yourself. For me, prayer is not meant to change God. I don't pray the Shema each day in the morning or in the evening because I believe God's checking off a box. God's looking, waiting to see if Lewis did his daily homework assignment and giving me a grade at the end of the week or the end of the semester or the end of the year. I don't pray because I think God will reward me for doing so or punish me if I don't. And I don't pray because I think God will give me what I need if only I ask for it with enough force, enough energy, enough conviction. I don't think that if I pray hard enough in the Amidah for justice, that injustice in the world will disappear. And I don't believe that if I pray enough force for somebody's healing, that miraculously that person will be healed. So I'm sure you're asking, why then do I pray? And before I answer that, I want to go on one more little tangent that I think is relevant. I'm in good company. I'm not alone in believing that prayers don't change God. Yeshayahu Leibowitz and Mordechai Kaplan were 2 incredibly important, significant Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. Leibowitz was Orthodox. Kaplan, a longtime professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, a conservative rabbinical school, later went on to found the Reconstructionist movement. These two represent the far extremes, the opposite poles of the spectrum of Jewish thought. There's really not much they agree on. But they both believed that prayer did not change God. For Leibowitz, prayer was a sign of one's recognition of God's sovereignty. We pray because we're supposed to pray. The same reason we keep Shabbat for Him or Kashrut or any other mitzvah. We do it because God's God and we're us. That for me isn't as compelling. But Kaplan said prayer wasn't meant to impact God, but the person praying. Prayer doesn't change God, it changes me. It changes us. I pray for healing to remind myself that there are people who need it. I might not be a doctor, I'm sorry, Mom, but I can help heal those who are ill by reaching out to them, by offering comfort, offering support, making sure that people who are in need have the things they need and know that there are people who are thinking about them. We can all do that. You don't need medical training for that. And I pray for justice, not because I believe God will banish injustice from the earth, but to remind myself of the role I have to play in bringing about a more just society. To remind myself that even if I don't experience things in my everyday life, as a Jew, I know what injustice looks like. And I also know that the world has a long way to go, that injustice for many is a daily occurrence. I say the Shema not to check a box, but to make sure that each day when I lie down or when I rise up, I remember and recognize that there's something bigger than me. That God, the universe, the divine spirit, whatever you want to name it, whatever you want to call it, I am but finite, and there's something about the universe that is infinite, something beyond my understanding. That not only is there one God, but that each and every human being I encounter reflects that God's image in an infinite number of ways. I pray words written long ago out of the Siddur, because they make me aware of things beyond my own personal needs and wants. If I prayed only for the things that I personally wanted, one, I'm not that bright. I'm sure there are things I would forget to pray for. It's a lot of things to remember. It also would be incredibly selfish to only think to pray for what we personally need. The same with giving thanks. Prayers of thanks in our Siddur remind me that even if I'm having a really bad day, as we all have from time to time, there are things that I should be thankful for, things in my life to be grateful for. And the set words of our prayers remind me that whatever I'm facing, whatever I'm thinking, I'm not alone. I'm linked to all those who came before me and used that same book and those same words. The prayers on the page are important because they help us to expand and to think beyond ourselves. I remember as a kid in Hebrew school laughing with my friends when we first learned that there was a prayer to be said after you go to the washroom. It seemed ridiculous to us at the time, a prayer thanking God that things open or things close when they're supposed to. But I know now many people who that doesn't always work that way. I recognize that each and every day that's something to be grateful for. But too often in life, we don't recognize what we have till we no longer have it. And the words of the Siddur are an opportunity to look through our lives, to think about all of the things we have to give thanks for, to think of all the ways we can participate in making God's vision, a holy vision of the world, come to fruition. So even if you don't believe that prayers can change God, or that God controls the minute details of our life, prayer can still have value. The same way 2 weeks ago I asked people to rethink God, to abandon the belief in a God responsible for suffering and evil in the world, I'm asking you that if you think prayer doesn't work for you, because you're thinking of a certain idea of prayer, before you abandon the whole process, take a moment, take some time, and really think about it. I talked to many, many Jews It's not just young Jews, I talk to older Jews as well, who don't think prayer has a place in their lives, that it is something to offer them. But the problem is that the conception they have of prayer is not the right one. In our Parsha this week, there's an incredibly dramatic scene. The Israelites are there right at the edge of the sea. The water is in front of them. And Pharaoh's army and chariots are coming from behind, getting ready to box them in. They are terrified. Nowhere to go, nowhere to run as they see Pharaoh's army approaching. They are frozen in fear, and the Torah tells us the children of Israel cried out to God. They cried out to God. Rashi, he explains that this means they prayed. When the Torah says here they cried out to God, they prayed to God. But what happened with those prayers? A few verses later, God says to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward." Rashi continues on this verse his thoughts from the previous one. After the Israelites prayed, when they were frozen in fear and indecision, God said to them, "Now is not the time for prayer. Now is the time to act." Remember, according to the Midrash, the sea doesn't split until somebody dove into it, until somebody took action. Rashi's teaching here is similar to an old Hasidic story. There were some students who asked their rabbi, their Rebbe. These were the students who would have been probably fun to hang out with in Hebrew school. They tried to stump him. He said, God created everything for a reason. So the students said to their rabbi, "Why did God create atheists?" And the Rebbe replied, so that when someone comes to them in a moment of need, they won't pray for that person, they'll help that person. The Rebbe told his students that when someone comes to you, you should act as if there were no God and no other person in the world. Nobody else but you who can help, you who can act. It's the lesson of the Parsha. The lesson Rashi shares with us from that verse. There is a time for prayer and there's a time for action. And that's part of the problem with the way many modern Jews think about prayer. We were taught as children, we all learned that you can't fit a square peg in the round hole. And eventually, if you never discovered that there was a square hole, you would think that that square peg had no use, and you would discard it. People were taught that prayer is something when we should have action. And prayer doesn't work in a time of action. But the problem is people weren't taught about when prayer is meant for, the time and the place that it belongs. And so many Jews today have discarded prayer because they weren't shown what it was for. My hope is that by offering another answer, perhaps more people might find meaning in prayer. Again, my goal isn't to change anyone's view who already has a meaningful prayer life. And I don't expect that those listening who don't already pray are going to start suddenly taking the Siddur every day and davening Shacharit and Mincha and Mariv. But I ask you, open your Siddur. Set aside some time. Once a week, choose a prayer. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Read through it in the Hebrew if you understand it. Read through it in the Hebrew even if you don't understand the words, but you can read the letters. And then also read through it in the English. And think about what that prayer can mean to you. What value it has for you. What hidden lesson, what hidden meaning is in there. One of the rabbis that I always loved, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, he wrote a poem about a prayer he prays before he prays. I'm not going to read it all, but the last couple of lines. In prayer, I am reminded that God has lived through me in loving, healing, helping, comforting, consoling, protecting, protesting, and wiping away the tears of the afflicted, soothing their pains, binding their wounds, straightening their bent spine. Through me, through my people, through humanity, I'm prepared in prayer to praise, to appreciate, and to petition God who opens the path to life's meaning. Each time he would pray, he says he added those two words beforehand, or at the end, through me. May you grant peace in the world through me. May you heal those who are ill through me. So this Shabbat, my prayer is that through each of us, we can bring prayer back into the world and help it to find its place. Shabbat Shalom.